Everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Trinity, and I am the events assistant at the Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House. Our historic site is located in Alexandria, Virginia, and is home to both the Woodlawn Estate and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Pope-Leighey House. In celebration of the 80th anniversary of the Pope-Leighey House, we are hosting a series of talks with professional Frank Lloyd Wright enthusiasts. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to quickly go over a few housekeeping for this virtual event. Please be aware that this session is being recorded, and if you have your camera on, your image may be shown in future promotional materials. During the discussion, we ask that you keep your mics muted so that everyone is able to hear the presenter clearly. We will have a Q&A session at the end. So you should see a chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, a chat box will pop up on your right side, and you can type questions into there. If you have a longer, more complicated question, you can just type during the Q&A session that you have a longer question, and I'll help you get unmuted so you can ask that. Now, I am excited to welcome author Paul Hendrickson to discuss his most recent book, Plagued by Fire: The Dreams and Furies of Frank Lloyd Wright. Paul is a three-time finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and a winner of it once for his 2003 Sons of Mississippi. His book, The Living and the Dead, was a 1996 finalist for the National Book Award, and his 2011 Hemingway's Boat was a New York Times and London bestseller. He has been the recipient of writing fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Lyndhurst Foundation, and the Alicia Patterson Foundation. Since 1998, he has been on the faculty of the Creating Writing program at the University of Pennsylvania, and for 2 decades before that, he was a staff writer at the Washington Post. In 2009, he was a joint visiting professor of documentary practice at Duke University and of American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is the father of 2 grown sons, both working in media, and he lives with his wife, Cecilia, a retired nurse in Washington, D.C. and outside of Philadelphia. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul.
Thank you very much, Trinity, for having me. Hello out there in Zoom America. Thank you for tuning in the midst of what is a bright Sunday here in Philadelphia, and I hope bright where you are. I'm thinking you're interrupting your Sunday afternoon in some way. I hope I can make this worth your while. I think Trinity actually is going to start a slideshow. And these slides maybe can be thought of as background music to the remarks that I'll make. We may, during the question and answer period, hopefully we'll have some questions, come back to a particular image or slide that you see here. There's one that's coming up in a minute that's actually very important. It's my boyhood Frank Lloyd Wright house. It may explain how I got onto this project that formed itself in my pea brain when I was 9 years old, more than 6 decades ago. But we'll let that hang for a moment. I'm talking to you from Philadelphia, from the suburbs of Philadelphia. We also have a happy presence in Washington, D.C. It's kind of our home, really. I got married to my wife of 42 years in Washington. We had our 2 sons in Washington, one of whom works for Washingtonian magazine on the business side. I wrote parts of 4 books in Washington. I was a longtime staff writer at the Washington Post. So a lot of my history, even though I am a native Midwesterner, happens to be tied up with Washington. And it was a happy feeling in me today, knowing that I was going to do a program that has its origins with this magnificent house, the Pope-Leighey, in suburban Virginia, down near Alexandria on the Woodlawn Plantation. I have what I think of as kind of a standard book talk. I was giving it around the country a lot last year in live settings before the COVID shut us all down. The book came out in hardback a year ago, roughly at this time, around October 1st, and the vintage softcover edition is out now. I wonder, though, if thinking particularly of this day and this audience, I could tell you a story that relates to the Washington Post, and in particular to the Pope-Leighey house. In Trinity's remarks, she was saying some of the so-called accomplishments that I've had. You'll note there's a lot of bridesmaid and not always a bride. I was a runner-up. I was a finalist for this and for that. And in 1996, indeed, I was a finalist for the National Book Award for a book about Vietnam called The Living and the Dead. I was a staff writer at the Washington Post. That was in the fall of 1996. I found myself after that in a kind of writing funk. Of course, I had to take up my job again at the Post. I was off for a few weeks promoting the book. It probably had something to do with the fact that I did not win. I was a bridesmaid. But I think I was having some trouble just finding my footing on finding feature stories to write again. I was a staff writer for both the Post magazine and, more importantly, or most of my time, for the style section of the Post. And one day, a photographer for the Post, who's not listening in right now, I just heard from him a bit ago. I think he's on assignment this very moment for the Post. I left the Post more than 20 years ago, but John McDonnell, that's his name, still a great, great photographer for the Post. For my money, maybe one of the 2 or 3 or 4 best photographers in the history of the Washington Post. I don't know whether he was reading the tarot cards and knew that I was kind of at a certain loose end. But one day, right after the turn of the year, so it's early 1997, he came by my desk and he said, "Hey, Paul, do you know about the Pope-Leighey house by Frank Lloyd Wright down in Virginia, down toward Mount Vernon?" And I said, "Actually, John, I do not." And I don't know at this moment whether, if he were listening in, or if we could get him to talk on the chat, I would ask this question. I was kind of a Frank Lloyd Wright hand at that point. And we'll maybe talk more about this later, but I did not know about the Pope-Leighey. And John said, "I think there's a story there for you." He said, first of all, Lauren Pope, the man who originally commissioned the house from Mr. Wright, was an old Washington Post newspaper guy, and he's got a great story, and there's some tragedy tied up with it, but he'd be a great interview, and you can go through the house. So long story short, I did that. And the story was published in February of 1997. And by no means was it my first brush with Frank Lloyd Wright, but you might say it was the newest, latest brush I had with Frank Lloyd Wright that activated my imagination. Maybe to think about him in possibly deeper ways, maybe a book way. Well, another 3 or so books got written in between, but finally a book did get written, published last year, that we were just talking about. That 1997 story I wrote, and it was I've just pulled up an old faded, crumbling copy of the story. It was called A House Where Dreams Dwell, and the photographs were taken by John McDonnell. Magnificent photos. I wonder if I could read you just the opening 3 short paragraphs to that 1997 Washington Post story. Here's how it began. It's like walking through a haiku. It feels as well made as custom cabinetry, mortared and mitered and tight. These nearly 6 decades later, the cypress of its board and batten walls has turned a kind of gleaming butternut. So the effect is a little like being inside a jack-o'-lantern. And it's about that big too. You won't find many closets in the Pope-Leighey house. Frank Lloyd Wright didn't believe in a lot of closets and storage space for the common man. Like Thoreau, like Jesus, he thought too many material possessions an unhealthy thing. It may have been the only thing he had in common with Jesus. You won't find many nails in this miniature marvel. The bulk of it is put together with wood screws, and so on and so forth. It was my attempt at evoking the house, and more importantly, it was my attempt at trying to say something who this man who commissioned it, Loren Pope, in the late 1930s from Mr. Wright, who that man was. I'm so grateful to have gotten to know him, to have spent time with him, and indeed a few years later, not a few years later, a dozen years later or more, when I was plunged into a book about Ernest Hemingway, I went to a retirement home in Northern Virginia to visit Loren Pope. I certainly wasn't started on the right book by then, but I went to visit him, and he had the same energy, the same joie de vivre. Let that be, please, a little introduction to what I'll now, I'll tailor what I think of as my standard book talk about what this book is trying to be, what it attempted to be. There's a long version, a short version, a medium-sized version. How about if I go, I'm looking at the clock, I'm going to take my watch off, it's 2:15. How about if I go 20 minutes, 25 minutes max, probably less, and tell you about Plagued by Fire, and then we can open this up to whatever way we want to go. So thank you. The book I worked on for something like 7 years, and it took me from Fifth Avenue and East 88th in Manhattan, where the Guggenheim Museum is, to Spring Green, Wisconsin, to Bear Run, Pennsylvania, where falling water thrusts itself right out from rock face, to Kansas and California and a whole lot of other places in between, was never meant to be cradle to grave, conventional Frank Lloyd Wright biography. You could say, I don't know how to do those. And besides, there are already too many. Rather, what I was trying for from the start was something I have attempted before in books, to find storytelling pockets in a life that might somehow stand for the oceanic whole of that life. There is a Latin figure of speech I recall from my seminary days. I was a young Catholic seminarian in my wayward youth. Well, that figure of speech is synecdoche, and it means part for the whole. The aim was to go roughly in a chronological direction and arc from east to west, from June 8th, 1867, when Frank Lloyd Wright was born in Richland Center, Wisconsin, to April 9th, 1959, when Frank Lloyd Wright died in his sleep after a hospitalization and risky stomach surgery in Phoenix, Arizona. Even though he was in his hospital bedclothes, I like to picture him there at the last at 4:40 a.m. that Thursday at St. Joseph's Hospital, the great silver-haired dandy with the swept side bangs, so vain about his dress as he was about everything else in life, fitted out and all set to go in his rolled brim pork pie hat and Dracula cape and those goofy pants, almost pantaloons pegged at the ankles. The legend is he just sighed and floated off on the coolish air of that fine desert spring morning. Frank Lloyd Wright, born 2 years after the end of the Civil War, dead not quite 2 years after the launch of Sputnik. 91 years and 10 months on the earth. Poof, perfect, gone. But possibly not before he had slipped into the left side pocket of his jacket one of his soft black drafting pencils, along with a pocket knife for sharpening it, so that he might polish off a drawing or two in heaven. Nothing so seductive in this life, he once said, than the prospect of sitting down to a blank piece of saffron-colored onion skin paper with a stubby, coal-black, newly sharpened, soft-leaded pencil. Quote, "There is no being lonesome after that," he said. It's almost hard to imagine, but in the last decade of his life, he designed nearly a third of his total output. He just kept rising and going to his tilted board with his T-square, triangle, and scale, with his fading eyesight and a periodic inner ear disorder that could make him so dizzy and nauseous he would have to crawl around on all fours like a blind man. Quote, "That is what it means to be an artist, to seize the essence brooding everywhere, in everything, just behind aspect," he once said, beautifully, mysteriously, Wrightianly. In 1991, the journal Architectural Record published a list of the 100 most important buildings of the 20th century. 12 of his were on it. Had he been alive, he would have demanded a recount. His roofs were legendary for leaking, but why wouldn't they have leaked? He was always pushing the limits of his materials, straining against the form. Quote, "I do not build a house without predicting the end of the present social order," he once announced. One of his lifelong dictums was that his buildings were like plants and trees growing upward in effect from the inside out, emerging spanking wet and blinking their eyes to the world. It was part of his gospel of organic architecture, even if his definitions of that concept were always shifting around like verbal tectonic plates, and sometimes seemed to mystify even him. He just needed to conceive the thing, draw the thing, make the thing. The thing had simply just shaken itself out of my sleeve, the old shaman liked to say. In a 72-year career as an architect and an egotist, he shook more than 1,100 things from his sleeve, a nearly incredulous number by any artistic measurement. They were churches, schools, offices, banks, museums, hotels, medical clinics, an automobile showroom, a synagogue, a mile-high skyscraper, and one very strange-looking Phillips 66 gas station in Cloquet, Minnesota. Overwhelmingly, though, they were houses, residences, shelters for mankind. And by that fact alone, I wonder if it isn't possible to start thinking of this supreme artist and insufferable man through a slightly different and softer lens. That is, he wished to create dignified human spaces that would be around long after he was not. I have been in several score of those places, and there are certain moments, if the light is falling right, when it will begin to seem as if Whitman is singing to Emerson or vice versa, channeled through an ego that could see both of theirs in the great stakes game of fame and self-love and raise you by half. There are also moments when what comes, as others before me have said, is the wonder of a religious feeling. Taliesin at tiny Spring Green, Wisconsin, was Wright's own home and the place where he had lived longer than anywhere else. In Welsh, it means shining brow. He built it into the not quite top of a green hill overlooking a looping bend in the Wisconsin River. Everywhere in the house there is wood, especially cypress, giving the interior, the more so in the lamp-lit evenings, a kind of pumpkin gleam. This hill and this valley were Wright's ancestral country on his mother's side, and he had known it and loved it since boyhood. 6 decades from his death, Wright worshipers from around the globe come to this bluffed and still rural and sweetly rolling neck of southwestern Wisconsin to wonder at the thing he made, rebuilt and rebuilt again. Yes, I am already nodding toward a 4-letter word, which was the leitmotif of this story: fire. For a cluster of reasons, and not without recognition of the risks, I chose to start the story, or my Wright story, right there or right here, you could say, namely Taliesin in Spring Green, with a deep look at the most savage and iconic moment in this incredibly myth-laden life. Some of you in this audience, I am quite sure, I think you're Wrightophiles, a number of you, would know instantly to what I am referring. That inferno midday, August 15th, 1914, when the greatest architect this country has yet produced suffered a personal catastrophe that would have destroyed a man of lesser will and lesser ego, although perhaps that's just saying the same thing twice. When a Black employee in a white serving tunic, supposedly getting ready to ladle out the soup, went berserk with a shingling hatchet and ropes of gasoline splashed beneath the door jambs. In 12 or 15 minutes of blurring chaos, small and quiet seeming Julian Carlton, about whom history is still confounded, managed to murder or fatally wound 7 people, one of whom, perhaps the first of whom, was the 45-year-old woman whom Wright deeply loved and had been living with indecently, that word is in quotes, for the past several years, even as his own decent and denying wife down in the Chicago suburb of Oak Park kept praying he would somehow repent and come to his moral senses. The attacker split her head nearly in 2 with one rounding swing. Her first name was Mama. Once she had been his client and near neighbor in Oak Park. 5 years before, these 2 lovers had abandoned their family to go off to Europe together, and ever since had been living in a kind of flouting sin. Again, put the word in quotes. That's the way the world wanted it. That's the way the pulpits wanted it. Wright himself was not home that noonday. He had left for Chicago 4 days before, intending to be back on the weekend. If the slayer had had his way, there would have been no survivors and nothing to come back to. As much as this moment has been chronicled, pored over, dreamed into by what is now 3 generations of Wright biographers and historians, there is still so much about it that has to be imagined, conjured, which is to say, we know so much and simultaneously so little, which in a way is its own definition of Frank Lloyd Wright himself. Riddles wrapped up inside of riddles, triangles drawn inside of circles, drawn inside of squares. But wait a minute. Who was Julian Carlton? And you're looking at him on the slide right now. That's a total coincidence. Who was Julian Carlton? What I discovered is that this century and more, the figure at the center of August 15th, 1914, had remained a kind of cipher, almost a cartoon of madness. It was as if we always had his deed and none of his life. History has had a hard time getting his name straight. And here I'll have to mention a sainted name from my Washington Post life, who had been at the Washington Post practically half a century before I even got there. His name will certainly be familiar to Washingtonians. His name was Shirley Povich. Do you know what he used to tell his young hires in the sports department? He used to say, if you go, it will happen. Perhaps without fully realizing, I was also being pushed forward by something Wright himself once said, namely, I believe that in the search for the answer lies the answer. So I went, so I searched, and some of it happened. And here is but one thing I found out. The slayer was never from Barbados or any other Caribbean place, as has been passed along in uncounted books and acres of newspaper feature stories. No, he was from backwoods Alabama, one of at least 13 children with parents who may have been born into slavery. And that is not an inconsequential fact. Okay, I suppose I'm now egging you, and not so subtly, to go pick up the book. I will say this much. The mysteries of Julian Carlton, with their outward spreading concentric circles, reflected back powerfully on Frank Lloyd Wright himself. Help me understand his life a little better. A life circumscribed by race, fire, murder, loss, regret, concealed haunt, and all of it, every bit of it, somehow inseparable from the gift of artistic genius. From the outset of this search, I was determined to try to knock back what I believe is a wrong-headed misperception, namely that the stainless steel armature of Frank Lloyd Wright's ego and arrogance allowed him to ride through the world for nearly a century without pain or remorse and little compulsion to ever look back. I do not believe that. He was always looking back, always looking behind, however surreptitiously. There's just too much evidence otherwise. It's there at the margins. It's ghosting at the edges. Sometimes it's not ghosting at all. It's in the narrows. It's hiding in the blue channels of the impossibly swirled life. It's tucked inside all of the letters. It's inside the autobiography. If only you know how to listen. I do not say that with any sense of ego, but I tried to put my ear down close to the ground and listen to his own words. Listening, quote, in my own life, there is much that is complex. It is difficult for me to square my life with myself. I cannot rest until it is done or I am dead. he once said in a letter to a patron in 1908. 3 decades after that, in a letter to that patron's widow, he said, "I only wish I had been less taking and more giving, but character is fate, and mine got me into heavy going, and there's no safe harbor yet in sight." Listening. Ugly things happen. I've said that the best and the worst of everything came to me. In the days after August 15, 1914, when his back and neck were sprouting with hideous boils, when he couldn't sleep or eat, and when he was rising in a little back room in the saved part of Taliesin to take ice baths, to go out on the hills in the moonlight, or gallop across the valleys on his horse, just consumed with grief and rage and haunt, this prideful man said to his baby sister, "You know, sis, you told me once when I was reaching so high that someday I would pull something down that would destroy me." A quarter of a century later, in 1938, from a letter, "I have found that when a scheme develops beyond a normal pitch of excellence, the hand of fate strikes it down. The Japanese made a superstition of the circumstance. Purposely, they leave some imperfection somewhere to appease the jealousy of the gods. I neglected the precaution." 10 years before that, December 5th, 1928, yet another letter, quote, "I have met with terrible misfortunes and accidents. There is a good deal of sadness back of all the bravado, and though you may not know it, I too have fought a good fight." Well, enough. You get the idea. Remorse, much less shame, much less secret haunting. These are not ideas we associate with Frank Lloyd Wright. But what if our ideas are wrong, have long been wrong, or at least not wholly correct? I suppose I don't really have another name for the thing I am trying to get at here, except the word humanity. The problem is when you are a writer in search of that humanity, wish to make a case for it, you have to be willing to kick away with your shoe so much of the refuse, dross, ego, arrogance, narcissism, behind which the humanity and the vulnerability will lie every time. That is the book I have sought to write. Oh yes, fire itself. If Frank Lloyd Wright has seemed to resist true explanation by his uncounted chroniclers, including the person coming virtually to you at this moment, and probably all for the better, this much can be said. He lived his preposterous life in a kind of beautiful rage, and flames ran through it. I have no explanation for this. I have spoken to you in the briefest way of this horrific event on August 15th, 1914, but it is a true fact that fire of one degree or ravage or another came down on this man like biblical rain, not just then, but in 1925, 1927, 1929, 1932, 1937, 1952, 1954. Even after he was dead, it was as if fire would not leave him alone. In the early 60s, there were 3 blazes at Taliesin West, which is in Phoenix, in Arizona. And those 3 blazes happened in less than 3 years. All my life, I have been plagued by fire, he once said in pure poetry a few years before he died, and giving me, God bless him, the title of the book I tried to write. Thank you. Thank you. I wonder if we could get now, maybe, to the very best part of this, some thoughts or questions that you have. And if you don't, I'll start yakking about some of these images you saw, but please, I'd love to hear from any of you. Trinity, are you going to manage this?
Yes. So if anyone just wants to unmute their mic, if there's any comments, that works, or write anything in the chat boxes. Let me pull it up. My chat box disappeared on me.
Hey, Trinity,
Yes.
I guess if no one else does. Just a quick question. Since it's great that you actually met Lauren Pope. This is for this audience. It's wonderful. Could you just give a few anecdotes about him? I know you talked about him, but I mean, because he had so much passion, I'm sure there's a few things to share.
He was such a wonderful man. He lived deep into his 90s. This was 1997, and that was the first place to start. So I called him up. He was living in a Japanesey kind of house in suburban Virginia with his spouse, with his wife of many years. And we went out and saw the Pope-Leighey house together on several occasions, and he toured me through it. But I knew I was in the presence of such a learned man. He was a humble newspaper man for the Washington Star, the old, long defunct Washington Star. And he had read Frank Lloyd Wright's autobiography, which had come out in the 1930s. And he sat down and he wrote Wright a letter in 1938. And he said, "Dear Mr. Wright, I wonder if you could possibly think of building me an everyman house." Wright was looking for that kind of person who was willing to take risks. Oh, stop right there. So fortuitous. Trinity, can you pause there? The Pope, can we go back to that picture?
Yes.
Right here. The Pope-Leighey house is a Usonian house. That's a term that Wright invented. Sir, I haven't forgot your question about Lauren. I'm going to round.
No worries.
I'm going to include him and keep coming. Wright built these immense houses, these prairie houses at the start of his career. And my boyhood Frank Lloyd Wright house in Kankakee, Illinois, which is in these slides, was an immense house. We don't need to go there right now. Let's just focus on this. The kind of house that Lauren Pope wanted built was a small, everyman, utilitarian, beautiful little jewel of a house that you feel you could almost rest in the palm of your hand. And ladies and gentlemen, you are looking at Usonia 1. The Pope-Leighey house is a Usonian. That is a term that Wright developed himself. He said he took it from the writings of Samuel Butler. The only problem is no Wright scholar or no Butler scholar has ever been able to find the word Usonia in the writings of the English writer Samuel Butler. Wright said it stood for something like United States of America, all collapsed into one word, Usonia, the Usonian ideal. This is Usonia 1. This is the first one he ever built. This is 1936. Lauren doesn't come along for a few years later. This is the Herbert and Catherine Jacobs house on the corner of Birch and Tepfer Avenues in Madison, Wisconsin. I have spent so much time in this house, this 1,500 square foot house with the bedrooms going off to the side. You can only, on the right, you can only make out one little bedroom right there. The bedrooms, they were utilitarian in Usonian houses. Wright just thought of them as sleeping places. Why make them grand? You go through the Pope-Leighey or you go through the Herbert Jacobs house and you look at the bedrooms and they look like Pullman booths almost on an old train. or maybe small staterooms on an ocean liner. The main part of the house was what you see in front of you, this glass-walled, magnificent thing allowing the light in. You see those bulbs at the top? They're 15-watt bulbs. He wanted all of it to have the jack-o'-lantern-like gleam and glow. He most definitely improved and modified and tailored the Pope-Leighey from this house, Usonia 1, the Jacobs in Madison. That's the living room, and right off to the right is the workspace, which we would think of as the kitchen. The front of the house faces the street on the opposite. He didn't want the world looking in. He wanted this family to be looking out their backyard. This is the Usonian ideal. It's 1,500 square feet. It's the everyman Frank Lloyd Wright. It's the everyman prairie. See how it stretches out? Now, sir, is it Karen Curtis and someone? What is your first name?
Michael.
Michael. To get back to the Pope-Leighey, I'm often called the king of the tangents, and I think you're starting to figure out why I sometimes get that nickname. To circle back around to your question, this modest wage-earning newspaper man from the Washington metropolitan area working for the Washington Star writes the great man a letter in the late 1930s after he's read Wright's book, an autobiography, and he asks him, he says, I don't have much money. I'm a humble newspaper man. Would you be willing? And Wright wrote back and says, Lauren, you will have your house. And sure enough, he did. So I caught up to Lauren Pope. That was in the late 30s. I caught up to Lauren Pope these decades later in 1997. He was such grand company to be with. He told me personal anecdotes of Wright coming to visit, of popping up unexpectedly to check on the building progress of the house. No notice, just knocking at the door, and there he was, and coming right in to put an extra bowl of soup on the table. Lauren Pope had an incredible crush on Frank Lloyd Wright, so could not see so much the ego and the narcissism, or maybe he allowed for it, but that was quite okay. Anything Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to be was quite all right with Lauren. Lauren, when I met him, was literate. We talked about poetry. We talked about Zen. He lived in as I said, a kind of Japanesey house. I probably was 2 hours into my first talk with him, and there were several, before he began telling me of a terrible, terrible tragedy. Life has its terrible mysteries and winding ways. Very shortly after Lauren Pope and his wife moved into this house, this dream house that the great Frank Lloyd Wright built for him, one of Lauren's children got out of sight, a little boy, and went down the hill and drowned face first in a puddle of water that was maybe a couple of inches deep. Lauren began squaring books on a coffee table as he told me this story. And he said, I haven't cried about this in a very long time, Paul, and I don't think I will cry in front of you today. But he said it was the largest single tragedy of my life. And he said, I was the one who let him get out of my sight. The house is called the Pope-Leighey today because it wasn't too much. It was a few years later that he and his wife left the house. He never left the house spiritually, but he and his wife, I think, had no choice but to leave the house physically. I am not trying to bring anybody down on this beautiful sunlit day here in Philadelphia. But, you know, a talk, if it's any good, is always like a classroom. It's a theater of expectation. It's spontaneous, it's organic, to use a word Wright would like. You say what you feel you have to say at the moment. So I just told this story about Lauren. Might I say a personal story and say it in 30 or 45 seconds? We're living, as each of us know, in this terrible, terrible moment of history. It seems like there's an end in sight, but what kind of darkness do we have to go through to get there first? 3 weeks ago today, at 5:15 a.m., I lost a brother to COVID and ineradicable underlying issues. He was a lifelong emotionally ill person. For 3 decades, he had lived in a nursing home in Illinois. He tested positive and it went downhill steadily, and he was gone within 2 weeks. I was unable to travel because of some underlying issues of my own, but my sister, my baby sister in Cleveland, was set to bolt over to the hospital and then to the hospice because they said he had a day or 2 or 3 or 4. He had less than 12 hours. So he died without any of us there. And our family is now part of that grim statistic in our national ongoing narrative nightmare of someone dying in a family when the other family members aren't there. I would bet that there are people in this audience who may not have a story that's sad, that's stark, but have some kind of story of someone they know or have heard of secondhand or thirdhand. I wasn't expecting to tell you this story today, and it came up because I guess when I wrote about Lauren and I wrote about that lost child large in the Washington Post piece, I had no choice but to write about it because of the way he told it so powerfully. So I joined the two together. He was a wonderful man, sir, and he was an author of books himself. As an old journalist, he got into education. He published college guides for how to choose the best college in America. I think of him as a Renaissance man. Spoke a couple languages with his big Coke bottle glasses. The story in the Washington Post was entitled "A House Where Dreams Dwell." And John McDonnell, the photographer, has this picture of him looking heavenward. Classic photograph. That story, I'm not sure if you could look it up in the Washington Post archives for free, but I'm not sure the photographs are there. But it was published Tuesday, February 25th, 1997. Does somebody else have a question? Oh, I see all kinds of chat questions now. Pick one, Trinity.
So Cindy asked, of each of the topics that you explored in the book, which topic was the most interesting and which was the most elusive? Which gave you the most insights?
Gosh, that's so hard. That's only about a universe of questions, only about 5 beautiful ones. And because I was filling air and because I see there are other people who have questions, I'll make this shorter than longer. Oh, Wright himself, right at the center, is the largest mystery, but I was haunted by the mystery of Julian Carlton, this seeming cartoon of madness, whom every biographer wanted to get wrong, and half of them can't spell his name right. And he was from our own country. He was from Alabama. And did I pin down the riddle of why Julian Carlton did what he did that noonday? I absolutely did not. You know, I might say this in kind of whoever you are out there who asked me those very good questions. kind of the universe of question. Could I give you the universe of answer? With this, by quoting the poet Rilke, except I can't quote it verbatim. Do you know Rilke's prayer? It goes as follows. O Lord, let me try to be at peace that with all that is unresolved in my heart, and learn to love the questions themselves. That's all I'm ever about as a writer. I'm a searcher, and I'm trying to learn to love the questions themselves. For the true answers, you've got to go somewhere else. Trinity.
Yeah, so the majority of the conversation was Jerry McGoy was trying to show us a picture, an image of, what was it? A reproduction of the Pope-Leighey chair that he owns, but I wasn't able to download it, so I'm not able to show anyone about it. And then Chris Van Dyke said, thank you for sharing your own story with us, and also about your time with Lauren. They truly deepen the conversation and is much appreciated.
Thank you. Someone out there owns a piece of furniture from the Pope-Leighey. Yeah. Wright wanted to tell you how to live your life, how to sleep your life, how to eat your life, how to sit your life. So he designed the furniture. He often designed the silverware. He often designed the plates. Not for the Pope-Leighey, but he designed the furniture.
And Christy said, could I ask a question about fire as it relates to Wright's connection to Japan?
So is it okay if I ask?
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hendrickson, for this talk. I actually received your book as a gift about a year ago, but I haven't been doing much reading in the last year because that's when my younger daughter was born, and she's kind of a busy bee. So I look forward to reading it soon. I've always been, well, since working at Pope-Leighey House, I've been fascinated by Wright's connections to Japan. And I wonder about this idea of being plagued by fire, and the fact that traditionally in Japan, especially we're talking about early 20th century, when Wright's spending a lot of time there, designing the Imperial Hotel.
Yes.
If you think he feels a special kinship with his Japanese architect colleagues and with Japanese citizens who live in this country where they're basically plagued by the twin threats of earthquake and fire constantly. And of course, this is before their great rebuilding craze in the mid-century, when they start to, replace all of the wooden traditional structures with steel and glass. I just wonder about, Wright's deep love of Japan being even made even stronger by this kind of empathy for
Yes.
for living in this sort of country that's plagued by fire and earthquake.
I think his connection with Japan was deeper than with any other place on earth save his own country. He was a deep, deep lover of America and the prairie. See how this Usonian, this Jacob's house spreads out. It's replicating the American prairie. He wanted to celebrate that, but he loved, the prairie are the flyovers, and we want to get to the Rockies where the ski slopes are, or to the beaches of California. No, Wright loved every bit of it, but he loved the center, the heartland of America. Your question about fire in Japan, he related to Japan, I think, more than any place he ever traveled in his life. And I am absolutely certain that the fragility of Japan, subject to so many earthquakes and fires, resonated somewhere deep in his soul. The great egotist and narcissist was the first to say that the Imperial Hotel rode out that great earthquake of 1923, and it did. That's a whole other subject, which would take up too much time when we're already getting toward the end of the time here today. But as you were talking and making me think of the fragility that Japan as a civilization can be subject to because of natural elements, I'm now trying to think about World War II and my father and the P-61 Black Widow night fighter that he flew off of Iwo Jima for 75 missions at the end of the war. So I've been reading a lot about World War II, and I've been reading about the firebombing of Japan, those raids in March of 1945, in which all of Tokyo is practically destroyed. That's another kind of fire, isn't it? That lasted long after Wright was building there and was not traveling back there. But I wonder what was in his head when the firebombing of Tokyo was happening, much less when the atomic bomb on August 6, 1945 was dropped on Hiroshima, and 3 days later on Nagasaki. It's all, but my title, Plagued by Fire, derives most directly from that moment late in his life when his last child is getting married at a church in Chicago, and her wedding veil catches on fire at the ceremony. It was a Greek Orthodox ceremony, and the priest was walking around the bride and groom with his censer boat, and some of the coals got out and caught onto her veil. And Wright's apprentices had to leap forward and beat out the flames in the middle of this religious ceremony. And the ceremony then took up again, and Wright, the old man by then, with a cane in the back of the church, walking back and forth, mumbling to himself, says, "All my life I've been plagued by fire. All my life I've been plagued by fire." Do you know, ladies and gentlemen, and I thank you so much. I wanted this to be free form, but I have a pretty firm belief that the world, not least myself, the yacker, begins to get Zoom fatigue after about an hour. I see that there are all these other good questions. I can actually even click on one or two, but Trinity, what do you say? Don't you think we're about done?
Yes, I think there's one more question because I believe it's a quick one. Where is Julian from in Alabama?
He was from two places. He was from backwoods Alabama, down in southeast Alabama. You can hardly even find this on a map. It's called Cusseta, Cusseta, southeastern Alabama, hugging up near the Georgia line, but then later the family moved up to Birmingham. I was able to track them through census records and genealogical records. He was essentially, his parents had been born into slavery. So he was only one generation removed. And he was, you can't quite read the markings in the census. He was in a family of either 13 children or 15 children. The Mysteries of Julian Carlton would make an entire book. I've said enough. He was from Chambers County, Alabama. Go look him up. Go buy the book because there's a pretty good deal amount about him in it. Do you want to close us out, Miss Trinity?
Yes, and first, again, Paul, thank you so much for coming and talking to all of us. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who attended. We are doing more of these talks, so I will be sending out an email later today with more information on the upcoming one. The next one will be on Sunday, January 10th with author and architect Stephen Rice. You'll get more information about that. But yeah, I hope you all have a great Sunday. And again, thank you, Paul, for all your insight on Playing by Fire and sharing your personal stories with us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.